Thank you for being with us. Great many people from great many countries to a very, very important webinar of the International Center for the Study, Prevention and Treatment of Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma, ICMGLT for short. This webinar on multi-generational legacies of hunger as a weapon of war and subjugation is so timely today, so painfully and vastly timely today. Our speakers are extraordinary. I would like to, and we will have, I know already that we will have great engagement from the floor. Just to say a word about me, the founder of the ICMGLT, who will moderate this. I'm a clinical psychologist, traumatologist, victimologist, and psychohistorian. What I mean by psychohistory is how we live history today, how history is in us. And you will hear that very clearly in all of the presentations. I want to say good afternoon to everyone in New York and the East Coast. Good morning, California and West Coast. I know we have quite a few there. Good evening in England and in Europe and in Africa. I know there are many of you with us here because this is totally interesting to all. And some who woke up especially from Asia to be with us and learn and reflect on the importance of this war crime. Food insecurity, famine, and resulting displacement are again increasing around the world. The International Center for the Study, Prevention and Treatment of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma webinar will focus on their origins and explore how these challenges are being met, whether they're being met. Presenters will provide both a historical and a contemporary context for understanding how hunger continues to be used as a weapon of war and subjugation by focusing on a number of case studies, including Ireland, Ukraine, India, and Latin America. And I know we have very engaged audience members from Armenia, and Sudan and Somalia. We can just review the world. They will explore, our panelists will explore how to prevent the politicization of humanitarian need, which impacts disproportionately on the already most vulnerable in society, while further creating trauma legacies for succeeding generations. Our speakers are Kinealy, Professor Christine Kinealy, a member of our board, a graduate of Trinity College, Dublin, founding director of the Ireland's Great Hunger Institute at Quinnipac University, Professor Kinealy has written extensively on Ireland's Great Hunger of 1845 to 1852, one of the most lethal famines in modern European history, placing it in the context of centuries of British colonial rule and oppression. Her work also emphasizes the long-term impact of both prolonged subjugation and intermittent exposure to hunger and starvation. As I mentioned, Christine is a beloved board member of the ICMGLT, and with Andre Laperriere, without whom we could not have had this seminar, also a very amazing board member. They both chair our hunger working group. And Andre promises a special webinar on hunger per se as a trauma, not only as it's used as a weapon of war, on which we focus the current webinar. From Ukraine, Yevhen Hlibovitsky, a Ukrainian public intellectual who studies the transformation of Ukrainian society over the last century. He has founded ProMova, a think tank and a consultancy that has focused on cultural implications for institution building, trauma, and demography. Yevhen also teaches at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. He is a supervisory board member for Ukrainian Public Service Broadcasting. And we have to thank Yevhen's presence also to our Ukraine working group, to, in particular, to Orest Suvalo and Irina Frankova, who created this precious contact. And last but not least, via Andre, Professor Sumatra Ray Nutter. A licensed medical doctor and registered nutritionist, public health, Shumon is chief scientist and executive director of the NNED Pro Global Institute for Food, Nutrition and Health in Cambridge, and is a director of research for the Food, Nutrition and Education Work Package of a Global Challenges Research Fund. GCRF, as some people know it, of that program in India. He is also Ulster Professor of Global Nutrition and advisor to the GCRF Latin America Safe Water Program. As always, our webinars, the presenters have between 8 to 10 minutes each for their presentations. We then have a dialogue among us. We open the discussion to the audience, and we do have at least two who are already promised to very briefly speak. And then everyone will have their quotes last word. I'm very moved and very glad to give the floor to Christine Kinealy. Christine, the screen is yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm hoping technology works. I know we have Robbie, so just putting up my PowerPoint. Does that look like it works?
Looks good.
Okay, I just need to move on.
Yeah, maybe you can move it a little so people can see. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to, okay, I hope that's better. Okay, Yale, thank you so much for the introduction, for inviting me to be part of this very prestigious panel, this very timely discussion. You've given me 8 minutes, and 8 minutes to talk about 800 years of Irish history is quite a challenge. But I'll just start off by saying I am at a university in Connecticut. I'm based in America, although I am Irish. My interest is Irish. I am a historian, so I am going to give some historical context for understanding a famine that a lot of people are aware of, but maybe not all of the nuances. It's very, very complicated. So we call it the Great Famine, 1845 to 52, but when we have these dates, obviously they're false dates. When do famines really end, which is a question I'm very interested in. And then as an Irish historian, we know there were crises before 1845 and again after 1852. So even though I'm focusing on this particular famine, bear in mind, this is part of a much, much longer continuum of subsistence crises. Number of controversies, of course, and how do you name it? In Ireland, we tend to call it the Great Irish Famine. In America, there are people who object to that because they believe famine means food shortages simply. And they prefer to call it the Great Hunger, which in Irish is An Gota Mór. People who lived through it tended to call it the bad times, An Drochail. I tend to use these all interchangeably, but I'm happy to explain why. Again, a whole debate about is it genocide, which is a very controversial issue also. So I was a student in Dublin in the 1980s. I went to Trinity College. And what's really remarkable, my PhD was on poverty, the poor law, was that up to 1995, there was a real silence about the famine, and I believe a very unhealthy silence. Up to this year, the famine was not part of the curriculum either in Irish schools or in universities. It only became part of the school curriculum in this century. There were no official monuments in Ireland or elsewhere. Now there are many monuments throughout the world, but most of them are post-1995. And remarkably, few scholarly books have been written on this topic. And when I wrote my first book, came out at the end of 1994, at that point, there were only 2 major books on the Great Famine, and they were very different. One was by a woman who was not attached to any university, and it was a very engaged, emotional look at what had happened. The academic community did not like it. The other major book was by a number of academics who had been literally paid by the Irish Prime Minister. He had commissioned them to write a book, which came out 11 years too late, and it was very sanitized. In it, they said, we don't want to talk about unpalatable issues like murder, like death, like folk history. So 2 very different, one very emotional and one very sanitized view. And then 95, things start to change. That was the 150th anniversary of the first appearance of blight. And I was part of that new generation of scholars who started to look at the famine and started to question the silences and started to question the role of the British government. At the time, I was seen as a young radical. Now I'm old and very orthodox. But since 1995, there has been a burgeoning of interest, and it shows no sign of slowing down. So there's scholarly publications, it's taught in schools, universities now, a lot of heritage sites, memorials, poetry. There's an opera about the famine. There's even a graphic novel, which I contributed to. So very, very different. But as you can see, this is in the last 25, less than 30 years. So just to go back, for me, how do we understand this famine that occurred in the 19th century in Europe? And my central question is, how did a famine of such magnitude occur at the heart of the British Empire? And I know we're going to hear about India later, also part of the British Empire, also famine-stricken on many occasions. And this is the richest empire in the world that had multiple resources, but an empire that chose not to use those resources to help the starving people in Ireland. So straight away it becomes political. It's not just about food shortages. How do we understand it? And for me, again, we have to understand the long colonial history of Ireland. It's sometimes said that Ireland is England, Britain's first colony. The invasion, as we call it, goes back to the 12th century, so over 800 years. And the Anglo-Normans who came, they came as knights, as warriors, And they had their own historian, Gerard of Wales, and he wrote the history of this invasion of Ireland. And this is just a very small extract. I think you'll recognize this tool of colonization. This people is then a barbarous people, literally barbarous. Judged according to modern ideas, they are uncultivated, not only in their external appearance of their dress, but also in their flowing hair and beards. All their habits are the habits of barbarians. So straight away, this society is categorized as being backwards, uncultivated, and of course, the English, as they became, are there to bring civilization to these people. So, jumping forward, centuries of dispossession, of marginalization of the native Irish people. And they were literally moved to the poorest areas in the west of Ireland. The saying of Oliver Cromwell was to hell or to Connaught. And so people had very little access to land and very little access to good land. And just one statistic, 1714, Catholics, 85% of the population owned 5% of land. And that was usually land of the poorest quality. And at this point, potatoes become very important. Potatoes are not indigenous to Ireland. They were brought there in the 16th century, but they're very well suited to the moderate climate of Ireland, and they literally grow anywhere. You can even grow them in sand. They're very prolific. And if you eat them with their jackets on, they are highly, highly nutritious. So for Irish people, the Irish poor, potatoes represented a wonder food. And they started to rely on them, depend on them, not because they were stupid or lazy, but really they had very little choice. Various avenues of economic, political progression had been closed off to them very, very deliberately. But of course, relying on one crop, as we know, made the Irish people vulnerable. And 1845, a new disease appeared in Ireland. It was generally referred to as a blight. Everybody thought it would just come for 1 year. Irish people were resilient. They were very used to 1 year food shortages. They pawned what goods they had. They slaughtered their pig, etc. They knew how to survive. Unfortunately, this proved to be 7 consecutive years of shortages, and they could not survive without external assistance. And at that time, they were governed by a parliament in London, which, as I said, was at the heart of this resource-rich empire. But for a lot of political reasons, providential reasons, economic reasons, the British government chose not to use its resources to intervene. They wanted Ireland to change, and so this particular famine became a tool of both subjugation and bringing about changes in Ireland. Charles Trevelyan, who's notorious in Ireland, who's head of the British Treasury, and again, someone who had a lot of involvement with India, he was a civil servant who actually was in charge of relief for the whole 7 years. And this is just one quote. "The judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson. That calamity must not be too much mitigated. The great evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the Irish people." So Irish people were being blamed for their own poverty and their own famine, an ideology which obviously persists today. So why should we remember this event that happened in Ireland, but because of emigration has a wider significance? Well, within the space of 6 years, Ireland lost 25% of its population, which by any standard proportionally is a very large percentage. As we know, during any famine, there are certain groups who are vulnerable, and during the Irish famine, most mortality occurred children under the age of 9, which wipes out the next generation. Almost uniquely, in the decades after 1852, the Irish population continued to fall. Even today, 2023, the Irish population of the whole of Ireland is smaller than it was in 1845. That's probably unique in a modern democracy. Epigenetics, which is quite a recent study within Irish scholarship, has shown us that the famine's impact was multi-generational. We suspected that, but now we sort of know it. And one of the highlights from this research is the incidence of mental illness in Ireland in the post-famine generations. Ireland had the highest incidence of mental illness commitments than anywhere in the world in the late 19th century. And just to quote a famine survivor who said, music, poetry, and dancing died. The famine changed everything. And I would argue culturally, politically, economically, everything did change as a consequence of the famine. And I want to end, I know my time is running out, by somebody who sadly we lost this year, Sinead O'Connor. And in 1994, she actually wrote a song about the famine. She was very interested in Irish history, and she was concerned with the famine in Somalia. She actually donated one of her houses to famine relief there. And she wrote a song that was pilloried at the time by a lot of people, including by many Irish historians. But to me, her words are very powerful, and they really speak to that multi-generational trauma. And in some ways, she personified that trauma for us. And again, if I can just, some of the lines from it, if there's ever going to be healing, there has to be remembering and then grieving so that there can be forgiving. There has to be knowledge and understanding. And to me, her words are very wise. And I like to end my 8 to 10 minutes by playing you Sinead O'Connor. And
okay, I want to talk about Ireland. Specifically, I want to talk about the famine, about the fact that there never really was one. There was no famine. See, Irish people were only allowed to eat potatoes. All of the other food, meat, fish, vegetables, was shipped out of the country under armed guard to England while the Irish people starved. And then, in the middle of all this, they gave us money not to teach our children Irish. And so we lost our history. And this is what I think is still hurting me. You see, we're like a child that's been battered, has to drive itself out of its head because it's frightened, still feels all the painful feelings. But they lose contact with the memory, and this leads to massive self-destruction, alcoholism, drug addiction, all desperate attempts at running. And in its worst form, becomes actual killing. And if there ever is gonna be healing, there has to be remembering and then grieving so that there then can be forgiving. There has to be knowledge and understanding. All the lonely people, where did they all come from? All the lonely people, where did they all belong? An American army regulation says you mustn't kill more than 10% of a nation because to do so causes permanent psychological damage. It's not permanent, but they didn't know that. Anyway, during the supposed famine, we lost a lot more than 10% of our nation through deaths on land or on ships of emigration. But what finally broke us is not starvation, no, it's using the controlling of our education. Schools go on about Black 47, on and on about the terrible famine. But what they don't say is, in truth, there really never was one. All the lonely people, where did they all come from? All the lonely people, where did they all belong? So let's take a look, shall we? The highest statistics of child abuse in the AEC, and we say we're a Christian country, but we've lost contact with our history. See, we used to worship God as a mother. We're suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Look at all our old men in the pubs. Look at all our young people on drugs. We used to worship God as a mother. Now look at what we're doing to each other. We've even made killers of ourselves, the most childlike, trusting people in the universe. And this is what's wrong with us. Our history books, the parent figures lied to us. I see the Irish as a race like a child that got itself bashed in the face. And if there ever is gonna be healing, there has to be remembering and then grieving so that there then can be a forgiving. There has to be knowledge and understanding. All the lonely people, where did they all come from? All the lonely people, where did they all
And thank you. I think the word forgiveness really sums up a very powerful message. So thank you very much. And very good.
Thank you so much, Christine. Also for letting us remember her and for underlining the importance of silence, speaking, remembering, grieving, healing, which I'm afraid are issues too that are plaguing us about so many other crises we're faced with today, but particularly with hunger. And Yevhen, I'm sure that you will take us to Holodomor and to Ukraine, and to today, or pieces of today in the world. I just want to mention that one of the first awards that the ICMGLD gave was to an Irish young man who wrote and sings also about the Irish famine. Yevhen, please, the floor is yours, and I take also particular gratitude to our amazing Ukrainian translators, Natalia and Anya, and to our Ukrainian audience, community members. Yevhen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I am honored to be here, and I would like to show a few slides that are part of my research that I do for the Ukrainian Catholic University, but I also do it as part of my other work. Yes, you talked about trauma, and you talked about the famine, and this is the picture that we keep in our memories, because Ukraine has lost millions of people in the famine, Holodomor of 1932, 1933, and we can feel culturally the effects until today. This trauma remains in society and persists in society. It is part of the definition of modern Ukrainian, as we now see the political agency arriving. Ukrainians believe that they are the people who survived, who went through hell, so who survived in that famine, who survived in other difficult and tragic events of the 20th century. And it is reflected in our demography. This is Ukraine's average life expectancy for the last 160 years. In red line, we see the life expectancy of Ukraine. In yellow lines, we see the life expectancy of other European countries. And we see that Ukraine starts in the middle of 19th century, roughly in the center of demographic discourse of the time. We have approximated data, and that until the end of the 19th century, and that explains why there is no curve in the first part of the graph. Then we have pretty exact data beginning the World War I, and we see that World War I in Ukraine lasted longer than in most of the European countries, but it wasn't as vivid in its peak. The reason is that Ukraine didn't only have World War I, but Ukraine also had an attempt to build an independent state. Ukraine proclaimed independence, was independent for 3 years, had 3 different governments in that time, and was eventually occupied by the Russians. And as they came and established their rule, they went on to destroy the cause of sustainability, the cause of agency, the root of agency in the Ukrainian society. So they decided that they would like to exterminate the successful farmers. And when they decided to exterminate the successful farmers, that basically killed the entire cycle of agricultural business in rural Ukraine, which led to those who wanted to survive to basically being forced into Soviet collective farms. And this is how Stalin did his agricultural reform in Ukraine. The death toll is estimated anywhere between 4 and 7 million people. And these 4 and 7 million people are reflected in average life expectancy, which in 1933 fell to 8 years, the average life expectancy. But then we see that the Second World War was also extremely extremely tough on Ukrainian society. We see that the average life expectancy fell, and it fell basically creating the contour for the other European countries. The most cruel part of the Second World War, with extermination of Jews, with extermination of the Romas, with terrible persecutions of people who lived across Ukraine, across modern Belarus, was probably the worst. That was probably the worst part of the Second World War. Timothy Snyder has an incredible book called The Bloodlands, which is a New York Times bestseller, which describes how this was the most cruel part of the Second World War. And it's not that this was tragic in itself. This tragedy went on top of preceding tragedies. Basically, the people who lived in, who were born in 1880s were unlucky to go through all of these catastrophes, and many did not make it. Then we see there was another famine in 1947. Stalin decided that he wants to do a famine in Western Ukraine because Western Ukraine was not part of Ukraine when he did the collectivization. So he created another man-made famine. And then it would look like there is a rise of life expectancy, but the post-war reconstruction actually only brought Ukraine to where the most European countries were. And if we look from 1960s until today, we see that the average life expectancy in Ukraine does not grow. The average life expectancy went into a plateau, and it's some years were better than the others, but generally the life expectancy remains the same. Whereas if we look at other European countries, we see that they clearly gained about 10 to 15 years of average life expectancy in that period of time. So Ukraine is lagging behind. And if we look why Ukraine was lagging behind, in Soviet times, the life expectancy even fell because people were drinking themselves to death because they didn't see the way out. And this is what totalitarianism does. This is how it affects the culture. This is how it kills the people. These are the demographic bells just to compare what Ukrainian demography looked like in 1897 and in 2013. And we see that in 1897, Ukraine basically had a typical traditional demographic bell. The greatest number we have of the kids, the smallest number we have of the elderly, and this is how life was at that time. But then in 2013, we see a demographic bell of a country that has gone through many catastrophes and has lost life in huge numbers. And all of these uneven shapes actually show the effect to which catastrophes took away human life from the Ukrainian society. This is the latest demographic bell that we have from the map that was published by the Cabinet of Ministers, and we see clearly the loss of life during the famine. Most of the people of that age are already dying, but we see that, for instance, there are some years where younger population is less represented than the older population, and we can see from the previous map that this was more visible in 2013 than it is visible 10 years after, because most of the people who lived in that time have already died. So this is the loss of a life during the famine. Then we see the loss of life during the Second World War. And then what we see is the lasting effect. People who died, in many cases, didn't die only themselves. They also died with all of their unborn children. So what we see in every following iteration, whenever the next generation reaches the age of childbirth, we see that we have lacking a part of population because the parents have died together with all of their unborn children, and this is the way it's going to unfold till the end of days. Then what we see is how Chernobyl affected the steepness of decline in birth rates. We see that basically Chernobyl happened at the peak of the birth rate, and then after that we follow how Chernobyl as a tragedy which had lasting effects. People were not sure, parents were not sure if they can have healthy children in the area that was relatively close to Chernobyl, so they would restrain from having kids or would have abortions for many years. Then the economic crisis came, and by the time when a lot of families decided that they are ready for kids, they could not have the kids anymore. And then we see how the war that started in Crimea and Donbass in 2014 affected the childbirth again. So beyond the factors that we heard in the previous presentation and in this presentation, I want to say that it's not only urbanization that affects the birth rate. It's not only the demographic transformation, the demographic transition. It's also the lack of security that forces the parents to review how many children they would like to have in their family. And parents, in many cases, decide that it is difficult to have more than one child. Therefore, the birth rates go down, and then other factors kick in. And as a result, we get the situation like we have right now. In 2020, I presided over a group of experts that was developing the youth strategy for the Ukrainian government. And we took the data. At that time in Ukraine, we had about 3.1 million Ukrainian young people aged 25, 29. We also had about 1.8 million young people aged 15, 19. In 10 years, the group on the left will become the group on the right, and we will lose 1.3 million people. But this is without the effect that this war has on Ukraine. With many people leaving, we might end up in a situation where around 2030, we will have no more than 1 million people of the age group 25-29, and that means bad news for the markets. That means bad news for the sustainability of population. That is bad news all around. Pete Schmigel, who was at the time the CEO of Lifeline, this is a suicide prevention line in Australia, a New York-based, a New York-born Australian writer and social psychologist, has come to Ukraine to assist Ukraine in dealing with trauma after the start of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And he was shocked with what he saw. So he started writing op-eds to various media. And in one of the op-eds, he said that Ukraine, in his view, is suffering from a collective form of post-traumatic stress disorder. It is probable that because of the common trauma experiences, millions of Ukrainians have some level of post-traumatic stress disorder, even if they do not realize it themselves. We later see these effects in inability of society to delegate trust, low levels of trust towards institutions. We later see that in other issues like, for instance, consumer habits. And historically, Ukraine went through two traumas. One is totalitarian, the trauma that is caused by the state, which controls almost every aspect of life, a fear of strong and unaccountable authority. And it's also the fear of inevitability of the imposed rules. If the state decides that you will die, you can do very little. If you try to take on yourself the leadership role and do something, you are risking yourself and those people around you. And in many cases, buying yourself out of a bad situation is the only thing you can do. Therefore, corruption is perceived under these circumstances as a security tool. When Soviet Union shifted to autocracy, that was perceived as a relief. The other trauma that we have in Ukraine is a colonial trauma, which is a suppressed ability to design, improve, and develop own rules. Basically, form institutions. Culture lacks basic decision-making models, increasing transactional cost on any delegating, overseeing, managing, governing activity. So we have totalitarian trauma, and if we want to get out of totalitarian trauma, we have to change the rules. We have to create the rules. But the problem is that the colonial trauma prevents us from doing that efficiently. And this is why it took so long for Ukraine to recuperate after Ukraine left the Soviet Union. And it's only now that we say Ukraine at its best, but it is under war as a result. Extent and combination of these two traumas basically set Ukraine on a unique trajectory, but it also gave some strength. Pete Schmigel continues that on the flip side, in a crisis, it can also be a near supersonic survival skill at the individual, organizational, and national levels. The default mode for many Ukrainians is to identify, assess, and mitigate risk. This is in part conditioned by the disproportionate number of high-risk situations their country has endured. And it also affected how Ukrainians accumulate and distribute social capital, how they distribute trust, how they delegate trust, and that basically makes empathy the main fuel that society runs on. So in many cases, Ukrainians behave super benevolent, but not because they are so well mannered, not because they're so well intended, but because they are so traumatized. And I will stop here and allow to ask questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Evgen, for such a comprehensive analysis. I can see a lot of questions from the audience later and a very rich dialogue among us. Shaman, the floor is yours. Please.
Greetings, everyone. So I'm Shimon Thro or Shimon Ray, and thanks once again to Yael and colleagues for this opportunity to put a complementary viewpoint into this very rich, very timely, and also very important panel discussion, which I feel is really a precursor to systems changes that we need to bring about going forward. I would like to talk to you about a slightly different geographical as well as disciplinary perspective from the famines of Bengal to really think about economic and nutritional security and potential models or solutions through innovation that might have global potential. Just a word about who we are and what we do. So I'm from the NEDPRO Global Institute for Food, Nutrition and Health, headquartered in Cambridge, and working for the last 15 years, really without borders, and through 10 regional hubs, we're able to work across over 40 countries and counting, particularly involving at least 700 experts and interested professionals in our field across those frameworks. So really, to also share my declarations of interest, I come at this with the viewpoint of a medical doctor, so we are trained to try and diagnose and fix things. So that's one of the epistemological biases I bring into this, but also I'm trained as a public health nutritionist. So we like to look at what the implications are for public health nutrition and how indeed we can begin to nudge things in a direction that improves population resilience. You can see my other declarations of interest, but also an additional one is that whilst I'm British born, I'm of Indian Bengali descent, and that gives me a strong personal connection with the story that I'm hopefully going to be able to share with you. So that story actually begins in recent times in 1943. So this year we are marking 80 years since the famine of Bengal. But this was not a new phenomenon. This was actually preceded by the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, which, believe it or not, was followed by 10 more catastrophic famines across British India until this Bengal famine actually emerged as one of the deadliest recorded in history during World War II times. So this was the Bengal province of British India. That's now partly present-day India and all of Bangladesh. And 3 million people died of starvation, malnutrition, and related diseases, of which about a half actually died of direct consequences of malnutrition. So really, there were systemic contributors at that time. So there was, of course, war disruption. There was crop failure, and looking back at previous famines that had happened in India over several centuries, crop failure was, of course, one of the key issues. And it wasn't until the 1960s that the Green Revolution began to happen. And of course, there was a lack of transportation, so really mobilizing resources. And the political powers of the day would argue that these systemic contributors were no different to other systemic contributors in other parts of the world. But the question arises, particularly learning from what has happened historically. In 1770, there is evidence that there were a number of insights, particularly into actions that could have prevented the famine or indeed such a catastrophic burden. There was a very elegant elaboration of what happened catastrophically once again in Ireland with the Great Hunger. And by that time, there was much more of a notion that if certain policy actions were taken or not taken, famine could actually be engineered. And so the question arises, did oppressive powers learn this formula of engineering famine as a tool for subjugation? And that leads us to the synthetic contributors. So government policies being a principal piece. So the colonial government at the time actively pursued policies to divert resources, supporting World War II efforts, and that was the way it was justified, but locally unwilling to release rice stocks, which were stockpiling, and unwilling to release this despite repeated pleas, even by the local administration of the colonial power. And this was against the backdrop of already oppressive policies, such as the grain procurement policy that forced the sales of rice to the government at fixed prices, removing agency from those in food production or even food distribution. Not only that, this was a time that the Indian freedom struggle was at its peak. So the administration was unusually slow to respond to the severity of the situation, but also to absolutely every single humanitarian need that emerged at the time. And due to these structural contributors of policies and administrative failures, there was free rein for hoarding and the black market with a lack of preventative governance. So really the criticism based on a number of pieces of evidence, not only from the famine of 1943 in Bengal, but incidents in faraway parts of the world, as well as other parts of India over time, point clearly to the result of policy decisions against the backdrop of not only the freedom struggle, but also the fact that this is a part of India that was partitioned, reunited, and then repartitioned. So that entrapped millions beyond those who lost their lives in the intergenerational effects of famine and subjugation. And this is something which till today is part of the collective consciousness of the region. So what does this mean in terms of the complex burden of malnutrition and population resilience 80 years later? So we know that the double burden of malnutrition is a very significant pillar to tackle in population resilience. And this double burden is typically characterized by the coexistence of not only undernutrition, but also overweight and obesity, alongside micronutrient deficiencies in populations, which opens them up to diet-related diseases, not only within individuals at a single point in time, but through the life course, a given individual can experience malnutrition in many forms, whether that's stunting, wasting, obesity, or indeed the array of micronutrient deficiencies or protein energy malnutrition. So in other words, there are many, many permutations of the complex burden of malnutrition, all of which go back to wider determinants of diet, nutrition, and health. And as health professionals, we often look at the nutritional status of the populations that we serve and try to link that with health status and think about interventions at that stage. But really going all the way upstream from the freedom of dietary choices that people might have, the food environment that they live in, the nutrient quality that's offered into the food supply chain, and indeed food production itself. All of this requires to be addressed if we are going to apply our knowledge of how to improve population resilience by tackling this double burden of malnutrition. How does this relate to famine? So the intergenerational effects can be seen through heredity, and by this I mean that there is an intergenerational impact on families who are unable to come out of the vicious cycle that they're in. So a societal interpretation of heredity, but also the genetic impact. And that genetic impact is now studied beyond a shadow of a doubt through many longitudinal studies, which have seen that one of the reasons why metabolic disease is so prevalent in populations that have experienced famine, even generations ago, is because there is genetic programming for the body to store energy, because the unborn child is coming into an environment where really the body expects to be in a situation of undersupply or famine. And all of this manifests through premature type 2 diabetes and cardiometabolic disease, which actually has led to the coined concept of the thin fat man. And this actually has been uncovered in a number of studies by Yajnik, a physician scientist in Pune, where people may appear lean, but they have the metabolic disease profile of those who have significant morbid obesity, and this is due to genetic and epigenetic programming. Then, of course, the environment. People who were pushed out of their natural habitats and environments till today have not necessarily recovered their situation from that displacement. And tackling the other red items here, so socioeconomically, those who are intergenerational victims of this sort of phenomenon, they have actually been placed in a particular echelon or position in society where they're within a structural barrier ring fence that is very difficult to come out of without empowerment. And just referring to the different types of trauma that the previous speaker talked about, in Bengal and West Bengal in particular, which remains in India, there was first the colonial aspect of political trauma, and then there was also a totalitarian regime for a number of decades post-independence. So that too impeded the ability of generations to come out of that structural inequity that they had been positioned in. So the only 2 points here are diet and lifestyle. And if we say that people have free choice around diet and lifestyle without considering these other determinants, we are only looking at part of the picture when considering the intergenerational impact of famine. So having considered the glass half empty, let's think about the glass potentially half full. So I'd like to talk to you about an idea that my daughter had when she was just 8 years old. She's 14 now. And that started an initiative which actually gained significant funding, momentum, and has now become the Mobile Teaching Kitchen International, also known as Bhavishya Shakti in Sanskrit, which means empowering the future. So despite the famines of Bengal, this is a gift from Bengal to itself and also potentially to the world. So this story starts with something known as Tigris. This is a Cambridge University Global Challenges program that we had the privilege of being part of. And as you can see, this took an interdisciplinary approach to empowerment and sustainable food supplies. And it was badged as really transforming the Green Revolution Part 2, because the Green Revolution Part 1 had in fact modeled some of those aspects of food and agriculture, as well as nutrition, which were put into place by colonial powers, and cash cropping was one of them. This, in fact, reimagines the way we think about crops, whether it's through the International Year of the Millet, or indeed thinking about crops which are less likely to fail and more likely to lead to sustainable livelihoods. And then we had the opportunity positioning within this for the impact of rural and urban well-being in particularly marginalized communities and intergenerational victims of inequity, linking back to 1943 and 1947 in the form of the mobile teaching kitchen. So I'll just pause for a moment so that you can hear this story.
In 2023, malnutrition in all its forms remains a major cause for concern worldwide, creating an intertwining and overlapping burden on individual, public and economic health. Additionally, in the wake of COVID-19, deep fractures in food systems have been exposed. Here arises a need for a multifaceted solution to create long-lasting systemic change. The Mobile Teaching Kitchen initiative was contextualised with this in mind. As a mobile teaching unit, the initiative recruits members of marginalised communities and travels to festivals, institutions, office areas, slums and other public gathering spaces to reach out to people through highly nutritious yet affordable food whilst providing nutrition education. Apart from functioning as an affordable pop-up or food truck service, the Mobile Teaching Kitchen provides knowledge about dietary practices, access to lower-cost healthy diets, and associated information on adopting healthier nutritional patterns, thereby improving food and nutrition security. The initiative trains participating members from the local communities in entrepreneurship, nutrition and culinary education, and empowers them by helping them run the MTK food service as a micro-enterprise. With further scalability of the model within India, Mexico, the UK, the US and further worldwide, we hope to achieve significant and sustained impacts on the number of vulnerable groups positively impacted by the initiative and strengthen community resilience against malnutrition.
So that's the voice of my PhD student who is studying this topic at the University of Cambridge. And as she mentioned, the same model and transferable elements of it have been lateralized to other marginalized communities in India, all of whom have a common denominator connection with food crises, starvation and famine historically, and also in recent history. The same applies to marginalized communities far away in Mexico, where the Mobile Teaching Kitchen has now been adapted, and that is where I am headed next. And of course, even in one of the most powerful countries of the world, with the recognition of intergenerationally marginalized migrant populations, but also food insecurity, this initiative has now been adapted and translated to 2 parts of the United States. And tomorrow we are holding a workshop to actually accelerate this further in the United Kingdom. So really what this has done is provided one exemplar and one tool to try and change the narrative and remove those intergenerationally marginalized individuals, particularly women in these communities, to actually come out of that structurally restricted box that they have been put in within society and give them the chance to gradually muster their confidence, competence, and be able to communicate the fact that they are no longer an act of charity, but they are able to go from victims to actually champions. And we hope that these will serve as inspiration for intersectoral cooperation and to break the vicious cycle of poverty. So just bringing it back to the famines of Bengal, I would say, despite all of the happenings rather from the 1700s to the early 1900s, culminating in the famine of Bengal. During all of that, there was also the renaissance of Bengal, and particularly the messages that Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore minded us to carry through. And till today, this verse from the Gitanjali, which attracted not only the Nobel Prize, but a knighthood, which Tagore refused at the time due to the colonial oppression by the empire. I think these messages hold just as true, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake. So let us all awake together into that freedom of thought to interrupt once and for all this vicious intergenerational cycle, which must end from here on in. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Shimon. God bless Andre for bringing you, and you for being you, and you're part of our working group, whether you like it or not. Thank you so much. I omitted to mention that we will have a special webinar on Holodomor in the Multigenerational Legacies of Holodomor in November 26. We like to follow the historical, meaningful days to remember events by, and I'm sure we will go back to Bengal as well. Tagore was one of my most beloved reads when I was growing up, and I'm so happy you brought him back. It's just that I felt like weeping, actually, when you shared with us the blessing of your daughter's idea, and brought back to us that mobility and open borders need to be there in order for us to help each other. And that's one of the things we don't have today in some huge portions of the world, which is one of the reasons for famine today. So many other thoughts, but I would like to invite our speakers to a dialogue among us. Did you have any thoughts or reactions to or questions to each other at your amazingly enriching, humbling contributions? Christine, Yevhen, we can let Shimon.
For me, I was just struck between the parallels of the three different papers. So we're talking about different periods of time, different locations, but it's the same story. So to me, that was a very powerful lesson. And I think what you say, we're all the same, and we're all experiencing from these different forms of oppression, and the legacies are similar. So yeah, I think just the similarities between our stories really stood out to me.
Yevhen?
It's painful to understand how much effort it takes to bring the understanding that we have to the not only general public, but to those who fundamentally frame the policies. You know, century after century, generation after generation, we are faced with the same challenges, and we say never again, and then it happened again.
Yes.
And you know, it seemed that after all these millions of deaths We have learned something, and then we see that we haven't. So to me, this is it kind of forces me to think what we are missing, what maybe interdisciplinary work we would have to do to make sure that we connect not only with those who could see the historical value, but who not with those who can see the descriptive sense, but also who could proscript and who could actually see what we can do, how we can change the policies. I'm not inclined to say that nothing has changed. I think that the world has moved and has progressed, but still it hasn't progressed well enough for my likes.
Mhm. Same here, actually. It's that's why we created the center, precisely. You know, here we are, international, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, together, trying to understand and to perhaps indeed for the future, right, respect the rights of future, not only current, but future generations.
So
For life, for
I
planet,
just wanted to,
oh, please, the floor is yours.
I see that one attendee has their hand up as well, but before that, just wanted to quickly say that I feel that we have synthesized both the historical evidence from multiple sources, connecting it with the present day in terms of an extreme crisis and how those engineering methods of manipulation are continually being reused. But we've also then looked at the other side of the coin and potential solutions, but those solutions can only work in times of peace, not in times of war. And so I think this is about extending the legislative framework on war crimes to include food and nutrition security, because we haven't won the battle yet across United Nations member states in terms of enshrining food itself as a basic population right. But what we can do is at least start at the pointy end of the spectrum and ensure that such manipulation is not used, and if used, will be classed as a war crime of the severest magnitude alongside other means of mass homicide. So that to me is possibly the next interdisciplinary piece to bring in a legislative body of expertise to enable us to do that, because I think we have all the evidence needed, but we're not looking historically, we're now looking preventatively into the future. And we also know that if people are given a slightly better baseline to start, then solutions like the one I've described will have a quicker effect. So that's just my thought at this point.
That's an extremely important thought. And we have it at the center, we have plenty of international lawyers. And some of us built the ICC together, and certainly victims' rights together. So I was frantically looking. I think we have at least two of them in the audience, but let me just mention very briefly before I ask them to join later. David, Roger, be ready. That the Geneva Convention already mentions hunger as a weapon of war. The ICC does, the International Criminal Court does acknowledge it as a war crime between countries. But after Syria, the ICC actually, with Switzerland as the initiator, even includes the country against its own people in depriving them of food. But the trouble with all international or legal instruments in that sense is, are they, who ratifies them, right? And who ratifies, for example, the latter amendment? And so to speak, the bad guys are not those who ratify. So, but let me call on the others, on the real experts, to say a word or two, unless you still have comments to each other. I want to invite the audience to put in lots and lots of comments in the chat or in the question for these amazing experts. Orest, would you like to take the floor for a minute? Orest? Rabbi, would you give the floor to Orest Tuvalo, please? Is that possible, or should I read what he said? Rabbi?
Yeah, he's in, but he's not talking, so maybe just read it.
Okay, so Orest is thanking you, Yevhen, for the reflection. And he says, UN Declaration of Human Rights is promoted basic principles, right? But as we see now from the Ukraine side, international law is not working. And we have this repeating again and again. Even food now is used as a weapon from the Russian side. We need, once again, some internationally recognized values and principles. You are absolutely correct. And the moment Rabbi can add people to the conversation, David, Donat Katen, you can, and Roger Clark, you can join the conversation, please. Barbara Williams is saying legal approach will not work. We need to look at our situation globally. Well, we're doing our best, Barbara. Orest said he cannot talk. Okay, so I, with your permission, I spoke for you. And Barbara is saying we are setting ourselves up for global famine by persisting with growth economics, which is devastating our ecosystem. And Barbara, by several other ways. I did promise to two Armenian colleagues that they will have a chance to join us. I want to recall that last year we did hold a special on April 24, which is Armenia's Day. We did hold a special webinar on Armenia with Peter Bahwanian. Peter, can you join to say a few words now?
Can you
Rabbi?
hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, Peter, yes, please speak up.
Hi, thanks, Yael. Thanks for having me back. And I was very excited when I saw what this webinar was on. And I'm not sure if it completely connects to everything, but I feel like it really does, because at this point, the situation in Artsakh, which is Nagorno-Karabakh, has gone from very bad to much worse. And it's all about using food as a weapon.
Okay. True. And part of it is why I mentioned that borders have to be open to transfer food in also, or to let food come in too. Michelle, are you there too?
The situation that basically is very problematic right now is the fact that after the 2020 war that happened between Azerbaijan attacking the Nagorno-Karabakh region and with Armenia, they took control of the areas around the buffer zones that Armenia had kept for about 30 years. And now they've squeezed the Nagorno-Karabakh region to basically closing off the only road that connected them to the road of lifeline, which is the Lachen corridor. And they've completely closed it off to even international humanitarian aid. And it's been now over 275 days, which in the last, I would say 3 months, they have they've cut it off completely and just opening it up just to do propaganda and showing the world that it's not blocked. But unfortunately, the people inside Nagorno-Karabakh have been rationing food to the point where, there's people fainting. They have a few already that died of starvation. The farmers, which in general have kept the city of Stepanakert, which has about over 100,000 people living in there, with food throughout the season of farming and agriculture. They also can't even farm properly because of the fact that the Azeris keep firing on them, and then also have cut fuel to their machines and equipment. So it's kind of like just letting them starve to the point where they either leave, die, or become Azerbaijani citizens and convert. And that's basically the definition of ethnic cleansing. But at the same time, the fact that the international communities now are getting to be more aware of what's going on. We've been fighting false propaganda for years now. The idea of there's nothing wrong, nothing's happening, and just false news. And the fact that news itself and information has been so diluted to the point where people are so skeptical on who to believe and what to believe, it becomes very difficult to tell the story. And in my case, I had done documentaries for years, right after the war had ended, just to tell the story of the people that live there. And it's still very difficult for people to believe it. People watch the documentaries and they think that it's created, like it's like a fiction movie. Meanwhile, it's people telling their stories and their lives and their experiences and about what's happening. And this was before the blockade came in December of last year. And of course, it was a false blockade. They came in with the idea, with the concept that it was an eco blockade. Saying that the Armenians in Artsakh are polluting the waters. And then eventually, the hoax came down, and we realized, or the world realized, that the people that are in the blockade are just government agents and the military. And the Russians have been totally on the side of the Azeris. They've basically betrayed the Armenians because they had a military pact with the CSTO, which they didn't honor. They were supposed to be the peacekeepers of the region. They were supposed to keep the Lachen corridor open and secure, which none of that has applied. And right now we're dealing with basically an open camp of like hostages in a situation where they're relying on the outside world to save them, and the Azerbaijani government is not allowing anything to happen or to change. Just yesterday, a Russian humanitarian truck was the first truck that came in to Artsakh for the very first time in 4 months, and basically they brought in 1,000 kits of little foods and stuff and some blankets and whatever. One truck. And then we get a whole group of people online talking about how everything, there's no problem, there's no blockade. Look, there's people getting humanitarian goods. I mean, it's a war of propaganda nowadays, especially with social media. And the whole idea of trying to get your message across, trying to tell people what's happening, and trying to dilute through all the fake news, it becomes a job of its own.
Yeah, it seems you have many people agreeing with you in the chat, and I'm so glad you're here to share it with us. Michelle, I think your concern has been shared by Peter, but I know that Yevhen had to leave exactly at 2:30. I'm sorry. We will miss his wisdom for the rest of the time. We will take a few more minutes. But Anna, you wanted to say a few words in Ukrainian. Rabbi, can Anna say that? Anna, she cook?
Добрий вечір.
Yes, please say it because we do have translation.
Окей. Супер. Доброго вечора. Мене звати Анна Шийчук, я психотерапевтка, координаторка
Wait, we have to
психологічної
put the
служби.
English translation.
Окей.
Just a second. Just a second, sweetie. Oh, I don't see the translation possibility, but go ahead. You are translated. I just can't read it, so that's okay.
Hello, I am Anna Sheichuk. I'm a Ukrainian psychotherapist and coordinator of psychological service. And now, after the invasion in the context of the war, I would like to share my certain emotion and the question that I have had in my head for a while, and I have no answer to this question, so maybe you will share your reflections about that. First, I feel a lot of empathy for residents of Armenia. So that's a new story because I'm surrounded by the pain of my country, and it's valuable to hear about similar situations of global injustice in other countries that are undergoing that. And thank you for speaking about that. All in all, I feel a lot of helplessness, because one of the greatest criminals of the 20th and 21st century, Russia, there is impunity because law is threatening for those who are civilized, and this country pretends that they are civilized. And there I feel helpless because I cannot even imagine what this humanity needs to do in order to somehow prevent this huge situation of violence globally. And as a psychotherapist, not as a lawyer, the question that I ask to myself is what we can do, not only in the legal domain, but in the domain of human relationships in order to overcome this global violence that is committed by specific individuals. It is not something that happens just by itself. It is people who do that. So what can we do so that those people who are ready to commit this violence at huge scale, so that there were fewer of such people? What can we do apart from judging them or disapproving of them? So this is what I've been thinking about, and thank you. I'm happy to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to speak from the audience as well.
Thank you, Anna. I tried, since I didn't hear the English translation. I don't know if the others were able to, but either Natalia or Anya, can you share maybe a summary of it? Oh, Yevhen, did you understand?
Yes.
Could you share it with us, please?
Well, I think we will have to put a lot of efforts to penetrate the bubble. And we're preaching to the choir right here, but our real audience is elsewhere. And if we don't penetrate our bubble, we risk of being guilty of not doing enough. So it returns and comes back to us again.
So we definitely need a special session on reaching decision makers.
And I want to say thank you for allowing me to participate. Unfortunately, I must leave now. So thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity.
Wonderful, and we'll stay in touch because this is part of what we do. You do know that the center does have special consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council. And so we have to work together to move what's very slow moving situation. Thank you very much, dear. Okay. Barbara, you will be a speaker in that one, I'm sure. So go ahead, but you have really 2 or 3 sentences. I know,
right.
I know you can give easily a 2-hour lecture, but we really we want to share the wealth of time.
I just, Yevon was saying how, you know, it's still going on now, and then the gentleman who was Peter, who was telling us about the tragedy in Armenia, made it so evident that we really haven't actually moved forward at all, despite all our tragic experiences of the past. So all I'm coming from is we've got this huge existential problem that is facing the whole world at the moment, with ecosystems collapse, and, you know, with climate breakdown, the difficulties growing food are going to just increase, and we're in overshoot. We've been over the carrying capacity of Earth for about 100 years now. So we've got all these problems converging, and we're still pursuing economic growth, and this has to change. And I've put a link in the chat to my website called Poems for Parliament, and you'll find out there are actually lots of global initiatives to actually work together to shrink our impact on the environment. And if that goes through, then war will become very inappropriate, because we can only change direction if we are doing it peacefully.
Amen. I think, I don't know if there's anyone who can disagree with you with a straight face. Go ahead, Shimon.
So, yeah, not at all to disagree, but just to say that when I was preparing the presentation, I was trying to think of, you know, systemic and synthetic factors, and I think that perhaps if we look at those two things, obviously interconnected but somewhat separately. So what was being talked about by Barbara perhaps a moment ago is definitely a set of systemic factors that need to be addressed, which then actually heightens the threshold that people need to reach in order to use hunger as a weapon of subjugation and war, bringing it back to that topic. So that is another way in which we can chip away. But I think that there are 2 parallel sets of actions that need to happen. And I know that implementation of legislative frameworks may or may not work, they may or may not stick across borders, but really being very clear about the awareness of what does and does not constitute an act of subjugation and war when using the deprivation of food as a basic human right. I think that is one set of actions where advocacy can begin to pave the way forward, so that policymakers begin to create more sensitive policies that are preventative, where we don't wait till the problem has happened, but we see it coming with the right markers from many miles away. And then in the background, also chipping away at those systemic factors, including economic overgrowth. And even Keynes, as celebrated as he was as an economist, actually did many things going back to the famine of Bengal, which actually accelerated that position of overgrowth that was then further catapulted by the Green Revolution of the 60s and 70s. So those economic policies do have very, very long-reaching impacts. And so I absolutely agree with Barbara, but there are kind of 3 perhaps parallel sets of actions that we need to consider.
I agree, and but the truth is that if we have the funds, this is a very correct time to organize an international meeting of experts to strategize. Of course, to teach, but to strategize, which is very important. And I want to add Susan Kalisch's point here, who says possibly, Clay. Sorry, Susan, for mispronouncing your name. She writes, possibly the issue in prosecuting those at fault is establishing the intentional use of starvation as a method of war. Intent is usually very hard to prove on a local level. I cannot imagine proving it globally. So this would be one of the main issues indeed when we try to strategize. I agree with, absolutely. But yeah, I'm so keen on getting together to try to change in a meaningful way. And we have to continue talking about that. And I hate to end this, but we will get together again, no question. And I was wondering if Christine Simone will have last word for today before Christine.
Yeah, malnutrition, famine, as we've heard from, I think, all three panelists, they cast a very long shadow. Again, just some things my colleague said resonated. Samantha, when you said about height, Irish people before the Great Famine were thought to be the tallest people in Europe. That changed as a result of the famine. So, just the impact of things that we might not think of, which you explained so well. My glass half full, just to follow your analogy, is that most famines are man-made, and if they're man-made, they're preventable. And I think we have to work together globally to prevent them.
Thank you very much, Christine, and it's been an absolute honor and privilege. And I think that someone said we are preaching to the choir, and that may be the case, but this too has its importance because we are informing, we are sharing intelligence, we are being interdisciplinary, intersectoral, and most importantly, we are inspiring. So all beginning with I, but the thing that each one of us as the I and collectively as the we need to do is one more I, and that is I for implementation and ultimately integration. Well, two more I's. And with those two I's, let's see into the future and make it happen. But this is the platform from which we can springboard together. So this is a very, very helpful gathering, and I really congratulate you, Yael, and other colleagues at ICM, GLT, and everyone for sparing the time and energy to come together today. And little by little, we will move forward together, I'm sure.
Thank you. And my last word for today is Monday. Next Monday. Some of you might know that the Israeli government is going a little bonkers from a democracy point of view. So we're having a very important historian philosopher reflecting with me the next Monday, same time, on perhaps understanding the place of the Holocaust and that history on the current situation. So we will immediately disseminate this, and you'll see how we continue to explore these issues in every way we can. And please, all of you who know of anything that's missing in our library, immediately send it to us so we add it We aim to have the most comprehensive library in any discipline, any dimension, any field that's related to inter and multi-generational legacies of trauma. It could be a poem, as you saw today. It could be a beautiful literature. It could be a play. It could be film. We have a media section. And of course, scientific findings in history, any psychology, medicine you heard today, public health, on and on. Thank you for one of the most enriching getting togethers. I feel blessed and humbled. Thank you again. And thank you for everybody who joined us. And Michelle, I'm sorry it didn't work immediately to put you on, but I think Peter expressed some of the concerns you shared with me, and we will add yours to the website. So thank you, everybody. We continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye, dear.